So now I'd like to move on to concrete cases of post-disaster management, specifically looking at the relationship between tenure status, which I sort of just ended on, that last section of the lecture on tenure status and creating this idea of secure enough tenure status, and the ways in which tenure status are important for reconstruction. When I started off today, I mentioned that I really got an appreciation for this when I was trying to resettle families after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. And it was not at all on my radar that the extent to which families would have access to compensation after a disaster was directly tied to what their tenure status was before the disaster. That was a part of thinking and programming that was completely off my radar until I was in a situation where I was trying to help families and I was unable to help families because of what their pre-tenure status was. So if you look at the slide of the urban tenure continuum, that helps us to think about the complexity of doing post-disaster reconstruction efforts. Looking at that continuum from the pavement dweller to the freehold title holder and everything in between, those are different relationships that people have to housing and property. And in many of the places where we find that we might work and have to do post-disaster reconstruction, government policies will be pinned to people's pre-disaster tenure status. So to pick up on that and go back to the issue brief, my co-authors and I try to address that in box number 2. Right? This urban continuum can be rather overwhelming because there are so many places that you could fit, and depending as you go up that continuum, or you were very secure. And if your ability to recover and restore your livelihood is based on your tenure status, it's important that we provide opportunities for people to be able to show or document or otherwise prove what their tenure status was before a disaster in order to create that feeling of being secure enough. So if you go back and look at the issue brief, you'll see that we've got 5 sort of broad categories of where people might fit on this continuum and activities that you could do or fund that would help to sketch out what this secure enough is. Looking at the bottom of that graph, you'll see that these are people, most of those people fall into these very insecure forms of tenure. As you've learned over the course of this course, security of tenure is the exception and not the norm. So quite often you will have many people who were living in illegal settlements or squatting on privately or publicly owned land. They did not have secure tenure before a disaster struck. What do we do to help those people restore their lives and livelihoods and recover their homes and assets in the post-disaster period, right? In that relief, recovery, reconstruction periods of post-disaster management. Part of that is to think more largely and broadly about documentation that we could use to help people demonstrate their tenure status. Again, drawing on that issue brief that you read for today, you'll see in box 3 all the different kinds of information that could be used in service of helping people delineate or show their tenure status before a disaster. For example, payment of electricity bills, informal maps that have been done during these community enumeration exercises. When we do community enumeration exercises and involve local people, and many of us would know this from our work around the world, ideas about ownership differ from place to place. So what one person thinks in one country about what makes them secure might be very different in another country in another context. Part of what thinking about doing post-disaster management is in terms of land tenure is opening up our minds to all of these different possibilities so we create avenues so people can recover their lives and livelihoods. So I would say go back and look at box 2 and box 3 in the issue brief because they will show you ways in which you can do demonstrable actions, right? 1, thinking about different types of documents that you can have be as proxies for freehold tenure status, right? Because everybody that sort of lives below that continuum from freehold tenure status doesn't have that formalized document, but they still had rights and they still used and had access to a piece of property before the disaster happened. How do you recognize those people, recognize their rights, and set them on that path to recovery after a disaster, right? So, moving on to another slide, you'll see I've borrowed a graphic from the peace building presentation you saw a few weeks ago that really looks at these 4 ideas that coalesce around what we call land tenure and property rights programming. 1, we need to think about customary laws and statutory laws, right? So in community enumeration exercises, you will find that people use resources in ways that isn't enshrined in the law. Both of those are legitimate, right? Recognizing that those exist and giving legitimacy to forms of land ownership or resource use that aren't enshrined in sort of the statutory legal system, which you've been introduced to previously. Thinking about the roles of institutions, not just government institutions, but also local social institutions in terms of civil society, religious institutions, and the ways in which they use and govern resources. Then thinking about practical land use practices in terms of agriculture, fishing, and other infrastructure development. And then finally, I've added something called knowledge systems. And I've added knowledge systems because this helps us to realize that people have knowledge about what land tenure is, or how disasters have increased or decreased over time, or what the intensity and frequency of them have been, because people are experiencing this on day-to-day levels. So acknowledging that local people who may not be necessarily well formally educated hold knowledge about the environment and resource use and access in the world around them, and legitimizing that knowledge by integrating it into the ways we do planning. You'll now see that I have a slide that shows the transition from moving from a camp to moving into a permanent home. So on this slide, these are pictures from my work in Sri Lanka. You see a transitional shelter sites. So after the tsunami, people ended up in these transitional shelter sites. So this is a picture of one of those sites in the eastern province in the district of Ampara. I had said that I was involved in housing reconstruction. This is one of the houses that one of my projects built. I had a project with the United Nations Office for Project Services, and we built these 600 square foot homes for tsunami affected individuals, right? Now, getting from that transitional shelter site into a permanent home is not necessarily, there's not necessarily one way to do it. There are many different sort of implementation modalities that organizations take or governments take to get people from camps into permanent homes. I want to share the land tenure challenges and lessons from 2 of those implementation modalities that I worked on in Sri Lanka. One is called self-settlement, and I have self-settlement examples from Sri Lanka and Haiti, as well as another modality that's called donor-driven housing, which again also took place in Sri Lanka and Haiti. So self-settlement involves displaced people having to find their own settlement solution. Usually what happens is the government will give them money, and they have to go find a piece of land, and then they have to buy that land, and then they have to register that land, and then after they have that piece of land, they'll get more money to build their house. Buying a piece of land is not necessarily an easy task in many of the countries where we work, because many of the legal systems have these overlapping statutory laws and customary laws. We've seen in many of the previous cases how some policies from the colonial period are still in today's laws, but they don't really apply. The other thing that we have to think about, which was relevant both in Sri Lanka and Haiti, and also now in post-disaster Philippines after Haiyan, is who are the people who are most affected, right? The self-settlement scheme in Sri Lanka focused on the urban poor who were squatting near their beach in Colombo. When we look at Haiti, again, we had people who were amongst the urban poor. These constituency groups did not have a whole lot of fluency in land law and in buying land. The problem with the self-settlement implementation modality is that people couldn't do it because they didn't understand how the process worked. The Haiti Property Law Working Group had an excellent solution to that. So I want to focus on how they solved that problem. Much like in Sri Lanka, in Haiti, people didn't understand how to navigate these complex legal systems. So what organizations in Haiti did is they formed a property law working group where lawyers and civil society members sat down together, reviewed all the laws and policies, figured out which ones actually applied, and then came up with a really simple, straightforward manual that gave guidance to people in how to navigate the process. So what do I mean by that? I mean how to find a piece of land. And once you find a piece of land, how to write that bill of sale. Then after you've written that bill of sale, you have to have a survey. Well, a lot of people don't know what a survey is, right? So what is a survey? Who is a surveyor? How do you find one? Then after that, you have to have your survey notarized. After your survey is notarized, you have to register it. And then once you register it, you have to pay taxes on it. For people who don't have experience with these large processes, it's really, really hard. So to give you an example, at the beginning of 2008, 3 years after the tsunami happened in Sri Lanka, there were still 1,323 families living in those transitional shelter sites in Colombo. Part of the research that I was hired to do was to find out why are people still in transitional shelter sites. And my team and I found that one of the reasons was families couldn't figure out how to do this process, how to find the land and then get all their ducks in the row or have all of this paperwork processed properly and in the right order so they could register land. You know, from my perspective, if we had had these manuals of the Haiti Property Working Group in Sri Lanka, we would have been much better off. Right? So one of the things to think about in this case is where does land tenure fit? How do the institutions line up? And then really thinking about the relationship between the projects that we're implementing and the constituency groups that we're implementing it for. Right? It was very, very difficult for members of the urban poor who were not formally educated, who didn't have a lot of assets to actually participate in a land market. It was, one, it was terrifying, and two, it was rather confusing, right? The Haiti Property Law Working Group came up with a good concrete solution to address all of those land tenure issues and confusion in Haiti. The other example that I want to talk about is donor-driven housing schemes. Many donor-driven housing schemes, so I'm only going to talk about Haiti and Sri Lanka because that's my experience, involve relocation. So for example, a donor is given 300 families to resettle. The government then gives the donor a piece of land and says build houses for 300 families on this piece of land because those families are going to be resettled. The cases in Sri Lanka and the cases in Haiti, which are also reflected in the issue brief, show the extent to which oftentimes these pieces of land that the government allocates for relocation are full of contested land disputes. Again, this gets back to the clarity of understanding who owns what. So quite frequently, governments say that they own land, they allocate it for relocation, and then once it's allocated for relocation, all of these people pop up that say, no, that's mine, that's mine, that's mine, that's mine. And one of the reasons that that happens is because rights are not clarified. Part of disaster risk reduction measures and doing these enumeration exercises are clarifying that. But the point here is when you have all of these little disputes pop up, you can't resettle people, which means you have construction delays, which means people stay in camps for a much longer period of time. And living in these camps in insecure, tenuous places is not necessarily a good way to live, right? So it increases insecurity, it delays the resettlement and reconstruction process, and at the end of the day, it costs more time and money, right? By doing that proactive planning, by understanding who owns what, clarifying those rights, perhaps in using technology to digitize those rights, would help magnificently to sort of address these challenges that we saw in Sri Lanka and Haiti, right? So this was sort of, wasn't a lot of good planning, wasn't a lot of good documentation, which led to delays in the ability to resettle people in a timely fashion after the earthquake in Haiti and the tsunami in South Asia. The final case that I want to talk about here is this idea of buffer zones. Lots of times, this is the case in Sri Lanka, Haiti, and currently in the Philippines. Governments will put buffer zones in place along coastal areas, specifically to say, people shouldn't rebuild their houses on the beach because beaches are vulnerable areas and we don't want to be continuously having to pay for the costs of potential disasters. So they'll put a buffer zone in place. Buffer zones might seem like a really technical solution, right? So in Sri Lanka, there were buffer zones that were no-build zones, right? And you'll remember from one of the video clips for today, I have a case from Indonesia as well, where Indonesia in Banda Aceh, they put in a 2-kilometer buffer zone, and the majority of the people who were affected were fishermen, so they all essentially ignored the 2-kilometer buffer zone. The buffer zone language is to protect people and lives and to reduce the costs to governments of constantly having to reconstruct. But one of the things that they might be technical exercises, but they also have social and political connotations. So for example, just to give an example from Sri Lanka, the various buffer zones along the Sri Lankan coast ranged from 25 meters to 300 meters. Those became no-build zones. Well, it just so happened when you overlaid those no-build zones over the ethnic demographic composition of areas, you found that in the places where the majority group were the Sinhalese, they had shorter buffer zones or smaller buffer zones than in the north and east, which were predominantly areas occupied by the minority groups in Sri Lanka. And if you follow Sri Lankan politics, you would know that during that time after the tsunami, Sri Lanka was in a very bloody ethnic war. Those buffer zones became highly politicized as talking about land grabs. The government is trying to grab land from the minority groups. If they didn't become politicized ethnically, they became politicized for speculative capitalism, right? People in power are creating these buffer zones so that they can put in big coastal beach resorts, right? So why buffer zones are technical, they also have social and political implications. One of the lessons that has been learned from both Sri Lanka and the Philippines is the ways in which these buffer zones, because they are politicized, they change over time. So right now we have a case in the Philippines where buffer zones, the lengths and the distances keep changing, the nomenclature around the buffer zone keeps changing, and all that does is delay the reconstruction and the resettlement effort. So if you are going to advocate for buffer zones or you find yourself in a situation working with buffer zones, please recognize that these are just not technical policy prescriptions, they also have social and political implications, and obviously can lead to land disputes. Right, so some of these, in the 3 examples that I just gave, we can see how land disputes and conflict comes out of lack of clarity and confusion following a disaster vis-a-vis land tenure issues, right? So we have issues where in coastal beach areas, boundaries are washed away. Buffer zones are examples of rezoning. So rezoning land might sound technical, also has social and political implications that would affect your programming. Again, we often find that in post-disaster situations, there's a lot of chaos and confusion thereafter, and often large, powerful businesses or vested interests try to come in and take advantage of that confusion and grab land. So there's been examples of this happening with mall development in urban areas or with hotel and tourism in coastal areas. And then finally, there's another way to think about the kinds of tenure-related disputes that could happen in terms of hosting. And we've mentioned hosting a bit in the issue brief. When resettlement becomes protracted, not all families are necessarily hosted in camps. Some families are hosted with other families. In that protracted situation where reconstruction isn't moving forward, delays create tension, and tension can create conflict. Right? By understanding the ways in which land tenure systems operate, who owns what, who uses what, when, and under what conditions, documenting that before a disaster strikes would have alleviated a lot of the problems that we saw in Sri Lanka, we're continuing to see in Haiti, and some that are now cropping up in the Philippines. So if we have 2 takeaways from this section, I just want to say, remember that while we often think that land tenure programming is technical, it also has socio-political and cultural dimensions. And then also, if we do land tenure programming right, we can focus a lot on improving governance systems and social justice in the places where we work.